Marty McDavid. If I imagine most of you know her, and she will share with us more on her story. Let me pray once more. Melissa did it, and I just, Lord, guide our sister as she shares tonight. And we ask that your name will be glorified. We want to honor you, Lord, by giving you our attention, our ears, and our hearts to receive. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. If I get too nervous, I'll sit down. I want to start by telling the story of this vest. My husband and I, we made trips to China, and we'd been in this home before, but this one time there was a minority Chinese couple. Don had given them socks or him particularly, socks and gloves to wear because it can get cold up in the mountains. You probably can relate. And the next time that he came, we were there, and he didn't have the socks or the gloves. And so our hostess, Lisa, asked, well, where are the socks and the gloves? Because they were holding the hot teacup and warming their hands. And they said, well, some other people needed them more. And they gave this vest to me. It's a little big for me. I think they were hoping that I would fill in, but the thing that really stood out to us was this brother telling a story. In the days when Christians were really persecuted, his grandfather, his father, and he himself were arrested one time, and their hands were tied, and they were lifted from their hands, they were lifted up, so their feet were off the ground, and then the local police lit a fire under their feet. And they had to hang there for the night. And this brother, with tears in his eyes, said, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. And if he felt that way, how much more I, who have never been really persecuted, never gone through difficult times because of my faith. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life. It's my story, but it's about God in my life. I've done some really foolish things. I've committed sins. Surprise, surprise. But God has always been there. So if Juliet can put up the first picture, I'm so thankful for the heritage that I have. This is my mother's father. He was in his 80s at this time, and he prayed over me before I left to go to the mission field. And I know that my grandmother, his first wife, also prayed for all of their grandchildren. And that's one of the reasons I'm here. I know I might not even be alive if God hadn't protected me. And so I want to start by asking if you can own this verse. God saying, "You're altogether beautiful, my darling, and there is no blemish or no fault in you." I'll come back to that. So I was born in Finland into a Christian home. My parents were Christians. The whole extended family on my mother's side, my grandfather, who you saw a picture of, was a preacher, itinerant Bible teacher. His main topic was the end times, so I have some heritage there too, listening to Samuel talk about Book of Revelation. And church was my second home. I started going to Sunday school when I was about 2 and attended until I could no longer go, about age 14, because I outgrew the Sunday school, the kids' Sunday school. And then when I grew up and was old enough to go across the town on my own, I started attending youth groups and any services that I could. And I spent a lot of time there. And I didn't know how to say no. So when I was asked to share my testimony, I always did. But I felt it was so boring because I didn't really have anything to tell. I didn't have a radical conversion. I had not really committed big sins that I had repented from. So I grew up really comparing myself to other people a lot. I can't sing as well as this girl. I can't speak as well as this one. And my testimony is not as interesting as somebody else's. But I always wanted to follow Jesus. And like I said, I spent a lot of time in the church. And then one Sunday evening, I remember I was getting ready to go to church again. And Mother said, "You need to do the dishes. You need to stay home and do the dishes." And I objected. I said, "I'm going to church." And she said, and this is paraphrasing her, "It's more important to show your Christianity at home than being in church." And that always stayed with me. So even when I went overseas, I knew that the trip overseas didn't make me anything different. It's who I am inside, who I am in my relationship with God. I was fortunate enough, blessed enough to do well in school. My lowest grade was in English, so don't judge me. I was considered a good girl. My uncles, there were two uncles especially who always praised me, but I received a lot of praise. And it put a lot of pressure on me to keep this good girl image up. Inside, I knew I was not all that good. I had done things in secret, and sometimes I was found out. And then, when I grew up a little more, I decided to change. I'd always been kind of talkative. Mother would be a little ashamed. We would travel, when I was a little girl, we would travel from the town that I was born in to where my mother had lived her life and my father. And we took a train, and I would walk in the aisles and sit down next to a man I'd never seen in my life and tell about our family. So I decided that I will become calm, cool, and collected. And so I stopped talking. I stopped talking, especially at home, to my mother and father. And I'd always thought that I was an easy child, because I didn't do anything major outwardly. It was all inside. But I learned later that it was really a whole lot harder on my parents than raising up my sister, who was kind of explosive and said what she thought with a loud voice. And I shied away from any confrontations. And like I said, at this one point, I stopped talking. But I grew up with low self-esteem. And I was kind of melancholic, if you know the 4 groups of people. I was very melancholic, and I fell into these holes, dark holes often, and I reviewed everything that I had done that day and felt so bad because I'd not measured up. There were 13 of us cousins on my mother's side, and we spent a lot of time together. My parents had a summer place by a lake. That's very common in Finland. You have a summer place for vacations by a lake or a river, somewhere by a body of water, and build a separate sauna or sauna, as it is in Finnish. And my cousins, some of them had one not too far. So we often spent summers together, did things together, but I always felt different. I kind of withdrew. I wasn't sure if they really accepted me for who I was. And I often wandered alone into the forest and talked to God and wrote poems and prayed. And then around the age of 14, 15, I decided that I couldn't say what my friends or what I have is better than what my non-believing friends have. So I have to go see. I have to check it out so I can say from my own experience. And I thank God for his protection. One time I packed shoes in a bag, indoor shoes, and left home, letting my parents believe that I was going to youth choir rehearsal. I was actually going just across a fence from our apartment building to a high school, to a dance, a high school dance. And believe me, they were really benign in those days. But I felt like I was being chased the whole time. And in this detour of my life, I didn't really feel joy. I had not consciously left God, but I was miserable. And then one evening, about a year into my detour, I was in bed and God asked me, or told me actually, it's time for you to return. And I made a conscious choice to return. And I didn't do anything different. But I felt that night the spiritual battle. I felt like my bed was being rocked. Physically it wasn't, but I felt like the enemy was not wanting to let go. Like I said, I was very active in church, and I was always very open about my faith in school. This is kind of off the topic, but I had a friend who, every morning when she left home to go to school, she read the cards to see what the day was going to bring. And she kept nagging me, said, I want to read your cards. And I said, no, I don't want you to. And then she kept asking long enough that I said, okay, you can do it this one time. And so she shuffled the cards, and I don't remember what all she did, but she looked at them when they were on her desk there and said, I can't see anything. There too, God protected me. What really inspired me was sharing my faith in school, and I often did. In those days, in the high school, they had morning devotions, and they were really Christian devotions. And the teachers who normally did it were happy to let me do it at times. And it really sparked a desire in me to be involved in school ministry. My dream was to serve in school ministry, find a husband, have children, and serve that way the rest of my life in Finland. I never wanted to leave Finland. I actually stayed at home until I left Finland. Because I didn't want to leave even home, I enrolled in a university in my hometown so I could live at home. I remember walking into the university the first day, and it felt so dark. It felt like I had to put this black robe on me. And every chance I got, I was involved in a school ministry. Didn't really attend all the lectures I should have. And the biggest part of the should have was that I'm a perfectionist. And I hated reading notes, well, not so much reading notes by somebody else's, with somebody else's handwriting, but I couldn't stand having a notebook with 2 or 3 or 4 different handwritings. It all had to be the same. So that was my biggest problem. Then when I had finished university studies, I did the minimum. I got a BA in computer science, math, statistics, bookkeeping. Anything to do with math, I was drawn to. Didn't really know what to do with all of that, but I got a BA, and so I could leave university. I had finished, gotten my paper, and was wondering what to do with my life next. And God dropped this thought in my head. Now you can attend a Bible school. And I'd always said I will never go to this Bible school. There are a number of nevers in my life that I've had to regret. So I went to Bible school in the fall, and it was only a 3-month Bible school. I was home one Sunday. The weekend was free, and so I went home. And I was sitting in a church service in my home church. And I remember who the speaker was, but I don't remember what he was saying. But God asked me, and I didn't hear an audible voice, but it was clear enough. He said, "Are you willing to serve me with your gifts, with your talents, with your knowledge, even if it means going overseas?" And this was not the only time when God confronted me with something I'd said I will never do. But at the same time, he had prepared me where I could say yes, and I didn't know what it meant. I probably would have said no if I had. Sometime after that, one morning in the Bible school, we were praying like it was usually done. The day was started with prayer. And I was kneeling by my chair. And I was wondering, based on a conversation we'd had earlier, what language I would have studied in a particular situation. And I saw in this big capital letters in my mind's eye, Chinese. So I started reading about China, and when I went home, I told the elders and some other people. None of them were surprised. It was like they were all expecting the day when I would tell them that I'm going to go to the missions. And then one day, I received a phone call from a Chinese professor who somehow, I never found out really how, he had learned, he'd lived in another city, he had learned that I wanted to learn Chinese, and he was moving to my hometown. And so he called me and said, I can teach you. And that was an introduction to this complicated language. And I'll give you a couple of examples. First of all, it's a tonal language. There are no alphabets, they're all characters. Words can be 1 or 2 or 3 characters. And the tonal language, I one time was telling my Chinese friends what I had had for lunch. And I said, I had bao zhi. I should have said bao zi. Bao zhi is newspaper. Bao zi is Chinese dumplings. So, of course, they burst out laughing that I had eaten newspaper. There are 4 tones in Chinese language. A word for mother is ma. The second tone, ma, can mean what. They mean different. I mean, one word can mean different things, right? The third tone, ma, you know what it means? Ma. Horse. Horse. And then ma means to curse or swear. And then the neutral tone, ma, is like a question mark at the end of a sentence. So, ma, 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 ma. Those are the Chinese tones. I worked in a big company in Finland for a number of years. It was very much a men's world, and the men decided to test me. They told the dirtiest jokes to see how I would react, because they knew I was a Christian. But at the end, when I was leaving the company, most of them anyway had come to respect my faith. And it's not something I carry as a badge on me. I know it was God, because I wasn't always the best model of a Christian. And I was able to lead one man to Christ during this time. There was another person that God put in my life whom I was able to lead to Christ. She she came from a very different background compared to mine. From across the tracks, train tracks. She was just so different from me. But I felt like I had to go and visit her, even though her apartment was filthy and the whole apartment block where she lived, the staircase up to her place was filthy. Her friends spoke filthy. And one time I was challenged by God to stay overnight to make sure that some bad people didn't come and harm her. And I slept between sheets that smelled tobacco and urine. But this lady probably will have a number of stars in her crown because of the strong faith she had, the boldness she had. She witnessed to anybody and everybody. I don't think my crown will compare to hers in any way. Even though I was planning on going overseas and I wanted to live at home, I at one point felt that it would be nice, it would be a good investment to buy an apartment, rent it out when I'm overseas. And a friend of mine was selling this cute little studio apartment, and I knew I could get financing, and so I moved forward in those plans. But God, I was in a church service, and the speaker, at one point when the preacher was preaching, I had this feeling what he's going to say is for me. And right after that, he mentioned Moses, whose life took a very different path from his peers. He didn't do what his friends did. And I knew then that buying an apartment, even though it was what everybody else did, it was not for me. As I was preparing to go to the mission field, and I assumed it would be China, my biggest concern was my mother, who had grown up in a pastor's home. One of her youngest sister, was married to a missionary. They spent years and years in Kenya. Another uncle on my mother's side was an elder. Another one was like a bi-vocational preacher. So my mother had seen a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and so had I. Actually, I had always thought I will never be in full-time ministry. But God seemed to prepare Mother each step, to the point where she would always be ahead of me. Like whenever I said, like I told her, okay, I feel I need to attend a mission training course. And she said, yeah, I knew that. When I attended the course, I was given an opportunity to say yes to an open door in Hong Kong instead of China. And I struggled for a while, but I said, okay, I'll do it. And then I went back home, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I got tired of waiting. So one day, this was Saturday morning, I packed my bag for overnight, took off, didn't tell anybody, took off and took the train 2 hours to another town to where one of my uncles and his wife lived. And I didn't even know if they would answer my call, but I called from the train station and said, can I come visit? I was just ready to give up. So they welcomed me in, and the next morning, Sunday morning, they suggested we go to church. I didn't even know that they go to church. And we're sitting there, and the preacher preaches on Jonah. So I went back home. One day in this company, I was talking to an elder from my home church who was working in the company, and I've been blessed by having a lot of people in my life who I've been close to and been able to talk to. And I was venting my frustration that nothing was happening. And then I heard my name paged, and it was the director of the mission agency who was over these churches that I grew up in. And he said, he was a friend of our family too, he said, I have an interesting letter here from Hong Kong. Would you be free tomorrow? I can tell you, it spells out your life for the next 2 years. And I said, well, can't you read it to me? No, I'll come see you tomorrow. So I went home and I told Mother what was happening, and it was like God had prepared her for this too. So, in the fall of 1983, I was commissioned, and if you can put the next picture up. I was given as a gift, and this is not a cheap gift, a national costume, and that's from the commissioning service. So I flew to Hong Kong. I became the financial administrator of a multi-million-dollar mission agency. And I remembered the first 2 weeks sitting at my desk with the accounts in one hand, dictionary in the other hand, with a splitting headache. Because our accounting system was a little different, and the terminology I had learned in Finnish. And then about 2 weeks into my time there, the the auditors came, and they spoke English. But the company never went bankrupt. I shared an apartment the first year and a half with an Australian lady who had grown up in a church where the pastor was a retired army officer, and she played the part too. And she had a cat named Tiger, and the tiger just got on my nerves. I don't remember which one, ruined two of my clothes. And one day I got a call that my grandfather had died. And it was really a big blow to me, even though I knew that he would probably die when I was in Hong Kong. I cried. So Jean said to me, I don't think you should cry. He's in heaven. And then sometime later, she was talking about Tiger. Said, I don't know what I would do if Tiger died. I would probably cry for 2 weeks. Even though Jean kind of took me under her wings when I got there, she showed me places. I ended up going everywhere with Jean, and I felt kind of restricted. And all this, not being allowed to even cry for my grandfather, kind of added to my resentment. It took a long time for me to get over it. And then I was diagnosed with asthma and told either the cat goes or I go. And I left. During this time, I was dealing with a lot of issues, knowing I had not been the good Christian girl I should have been all my life. And God put people in my life to show me that even I, as a Christian, can be forgiven. And if you can put the verses up, Jesus didn't just forgive people when they came to Christ. He keeps forgiving. And it was a big, big freeing moment for me. But I came to realize that I didn't really love myself. And so after my first furlough, when I was returning to Hong Kong, sitting on the plane, I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to see any Chinese. I didn't want to hear any Chinese. But I felt it would have been too much of humiliation for me to get off the plane and not go. So I went and I told my boss, Chinese man, how I felt. And he gave me 3 books and said, "Can you take the rest of the week off?" I had just come from a vacation furlough, and he tells me to take time off. That was kind of shameful in my mind. And I remember reading J.I. Packer's book, Knowing God. And suddenly it hit me that Jesus didn't just love all the people of the world. He loved me. And that was a huge change in my relationship with him. And then on another fellow back in Finland, God told me to go and continue the ministry of a Finnish lady who had left to go to the mission field years earlier, many years earlier, had never made it to the country that she was going to, died on her way. And I didn't know where she was headed. So I went home and found a church history book and found that she was on her way to Tibet. And it was a big struggle for me. I knew Tibet was a dark, dark place, spiritually and in every other way. But I ended up making a trip there with a cousin of mine and ended up surrendering myself and said, okay, if you want me here, I'll do it. And the next night, God woke me up with these big letters in my mind's eye, no. And I was confused. And I didn't even know what to do with the whole thing of Tibet. I kind of put it on the back burner. And then I ended up in a university in China, studying the language. I thought because I'd had private tutors in Hong Kong that I could skip the first of the 4 levels and start on the second and spend a year and a half in China. So I had to take a test, and based on the test, they thought I should be on the 3rd level. But because that group was so large, they bumped me to the 4th level. So I only spent 1 semester in China and thought that I somehow would get back to China with a Finnish company or something, because you can't go as an openly missionary, even though the Chinese government knows what you're there for, but you're not allowed to tell them what you're there for. But that never materialized. And then about a year after that, a lady, who some of you may know, Heidi Baker, Heidi's mother-in-law, Marge Baker, was a dear friend of mine. We worked in the same office. She was like an aunt to me. She came to me one day and said, Mari, I just talked to this nice young man on the phone. I think he would make a good husband for you. And so she arranged a luncheon meeting. Don didn't know anything about this, but we weren't impressed by each other at all. And then a few months after that, there was a Bible school opening in China, and Marge and her husband were very instrumental in gathering or raising funds for it. And I went because there had been Finnish missionaries in this area. And Don was there because he had been working in that area. And Marge's husband came to me in this Bible school opening service. Mari, Don doesn't know any Chinese. Would you interpret for him? So we ended up spending time together, during which I told him in no uncertain terms that I would never marry anybody like him. And he thought, well, good. Well, Mads made sure that we had projects together, and so we kept seeing each other. And I tried to end the friendship a couple of times, and God stopped me. And then, you know the end of the story. But those were the most painful months in my life. Not because of my relationship with Don, but because of my sending church, the pastor of my sending church in Finland. And it's a story for another day, but I really was an emotional wreck when we got married. And then God told us to buy an apartment in Hong Kong, and China was going to take over in 7 years. But God had given Don the money to buy one, and we found one that had a small garden. And those of you who know Don, he loves gardening. So that was his refuge. And about a year and a half after being married and working together, and my Chinese boss inviting Don to join the ministry, he called us to his office one day and said, "You are no longer with this ministry." And he had called the mission agency in Finland, making sure that my sending church would know his side of the story. And it's just by God's grace that I was able to choose to forgive, even though it felt like a betrayal, deep betrayal. Don, I think I can say this, Don used to own Devil's Son Ranch, and it was much smaller in those days than it is now, but he had a vision to start a ministry on that property. Well, then he lost most of it, but he still had some left. And so after we had been kicked out, Don felt like God told him, okay, it's time to come to the States and start working on the vision. I had never wanted to come to the U.S. So I struggled, and I had not heard God speak to me about coming. So I told God one morning when we were talking about this, I told God quietly, I need a word. Can you please give me a word so that when the hard times come, I know that I know that I know that this is you. And God said, follow your husband. But I didn't like the answer, so I said, God, give me a verse, give me something more spiritual. And he was silent. God was silent. And then Don said, without knowing anything about this conversation, he said, well, there'd been a phone call that kind of would have opened a door to Hong Kong to us. He said, I don't know what this phone call was all about, but now my wife wants to know that she knows that this is of God. Maybe she should just follow her husband. So I did. Coming to this country was a big cultural change and shock to me. The first time we landed in the US, it was in Chicago at the airport. And I don't know that we should have been in this big elevator, but we took this elevator from one floor to another. And this big black man walks in and says, "Hi, how are you?" And I looked at Don. Don talked to this guy, and when this black guy left the elevator, I said to Don, do you know him? In Finland, you may be sitting next to someone for hours on a bus and never say a word to each other. And I also felt like I had lost my identity, even though I knew that being a missionary is not the most important thing. And that's not where my identity should be, but it was tied to it anyway. So for quite some time I struggled. Who am I? What's my place? And then we got involved in this church, right? So, well, this was kind of like Don's sending church back in 1987, when the church started. And I worked in the office, I did a lot of things, and one of the church leaders hurt me deeply. And I felt like I had been betrayed again. To the point where, even though I believed that and this is funny because Samuel just preached about this, but I had always felt that if God puts me in a church family, I don't leave my family. I don't leave my natural family, even though I argue and disagree and all that. But I was so hurt that I was looking for another church. But either God just didn't allow me to see it, but I didn't find any other viable options, so we stayed. And then about a year later, I had this mental picture of God sitting with me by an open fire. And God stood up and he said, "Okay, I'm moving on. It's up to you to move on with me or stay by your campfire." And I chose to move on. And in this process, what helped me was knowing that forgiveness does not equal trust. I could forgive, but it took a long, long time to be able to trust again. And I realized that it's a choice. Sometimes I have to keep making that choice. Usually it doesn't just happen like that. You keep forgiving. with the money that we had put into the home, the apartment in Hong Kong, which by the time we left had almost doubled in price, we were able to build a home here. And soon after we moved in, it was maybe a month or so later, Don's daughter called and said, "Dad, I'm going to check out from a drug rehab place, and you're the only person I trust. Can I come and live with you?" And I became a mother figure to a person I didn't really know, who was kind of messed up. She lived with us for a year, a little over a year, gave her life to the Lord. Today she's a beautiful follower of Christ, beautiful mother, and we have a good relationship. She calls me, because I'm not her real mother, she calls me Ma, if you remember the Chinese. Okay. About this time, God showed me that I didn't really understand what grace means. Even though I'd grown up in Christian home and church, there was still this thinking that I have to work for it. It was not conscious thinking, but I think it's very human, because we want to earn, we want to work for it. But salvation is a gift. You don't work for it. It's by grace. Some of you may know who Corrie ten Boom was. She said, "God didn't create us as human doings, but human beings." So I believe deeply that who we are in Christ overflows, and that may mean I do something, or I may not do anything. And then I had to learn another lesson, being a hopeless perfectionist, or actually not so hopeless. I've made some changes in my life, being married to Don. But Don's mother moved in. She lived with us for about 17 years. And it was a hard time most of those years. And I found that I couldn't be the perfect Christian girl. I could forgive her one day, and then the next day I was faced with the same issues. And in all of this, I kind of felt like I lost myself, my identity. If you'd asked me, "What do you want to do?" I couldn't have answered you. And I fell into a depression. And being a spiritual person, I didn't believe in pills, so I didn't go get treatment for a long time, but it got bad enough that I ended up doing it. And then some years later, God brought into my life a person who asked me a question. What is the deepest desire of your heart? And I thought about it for a while. And I know the clock is ticking, but this poem was born out of that. of my heart, symphony rises towards the heavens. Hauntingly beautiful melody plays on string instruments. Notes, all melodious notes fly on the wings of a butterfly, in the chirp of a bluebird. Bluebird is my favorite. Tenderly as snowflakes, powerfully as thunder echoing in the mountain tops, beating a rhythm of raindrops. My heart worships the King of Kings, majestic, all-powerful, beautiful beyond words. No words, not enough colors, not even enough notes. I'm painfully aware of what is not, and yet satisfied to know that it is enough. I open my hands to give, but I have nothing to give, only myself, my desire to give something beyond this world, greater than my ability to even imagine. Masterpiece worthy of the creator of all things. There is none, just me. This I give, myself, empty to be filled with him, desperate to be filled with him whom I desire to bless. I fall on my knees, on my face. My heart aches. He fills it with beauty so that I can offer it back to him. He fills it with a song to be sung to him. He fills my heart to worship him. He is beautiful beyond words. And in consideration of time, I will kind of skip my last few years. What I want to leave with you tonight, first and foremost, is how God sees you. You are his princess, beautiful and without blemish, because you're clothed in his righteousness. He has put a robe of righteousness on you. He has redeemed you from the kingdom of darkness. He paid the full price. You are in the kingdom of light, in the kingdom of the King of Kings. So my desire is to live a life of worship to this King of Kings. Whatever I do during the day may be a worship unto him. Whatever I accomplish doesn't matter if it's not a worship to him. And I've asked that we can sing one more song. I hope that all of you can embrace God's love, his grace, his redemption, forgiveness, and know that you can be free. You don't have to fear what other people think. You don't have to fear of failure, because he loves you and accepts you as you are.